He raises his glass to toast me while my cheek still burns beneath the makeup. The dining room hums with cutlery and polite laughter, the kind that floats just long enough to suggest warmth without ever landing anywhere real. And I stand at the head of the table with my hands steady, posture, perfect eyes, calibrated to catch every reflection, bouncing off crystal and polished wood. The glassware throws my face back at me in fragments, cheekbone sliced by light smile, curved in duplicate, a version of me composed enough to pass for celebration, and I let that version do the work, while the other one stays quiet, tucked behind the ribs, counting breaths. He speaks with practiced ease, voice low and smooth, thanking friends, praising the food, gesturing toward me like a prize he's proud to display, and I nod at the right moments, feel the heat under the foundation, feel how the room's brightness insists on honesty while everyone agrees to see only what's convenient. Chairs scrape softly as guests settle. A server refills water. The chandelier steadies and I clock the way. Eyes slide toward my face, and then away again, as if reflection itself asks a question they don't want to answer. I step back, letting the table take me in the plates, aligned, the napkins folded, the reflections multiplying until it's impossible to tell which angle tells the truth, and my husband's hand rests on the back of my chair with an ownership that looks affectionate from across the room. Someone laughs too loudly at a joke I didn't hear someone else compliments the wine, and the glass catches my cheek once more, a flare of light that reminds me to keep my smile intact. I respond when spoken to, brief and pleasant, careful not to linger, because lingering invites attention, and attention has a way of finding seams. The room is warm, controlled, curated, every element placed with intention, and I can feel how the intention tightens around me like a fitted dress, beautiful and restrictive all at once. He raises his glass, higher eyes on me now, and the silence swells just enough to feel ceremonial, the kind of pause that promises something good, and I meet his gaze because not meeting it would be noticeable, because the rules of this room reward compliance with ease. He says my name with a fondness that lands flat, a practiced syllable, and thanks me for my patience, my support, my talent, each word a polished stone set carefully into a sentence meant to sparkle. The light from the chandelier cuts across the table, slicing reflections into sharp angles, and I see my cheek again, the makeup holding the bruise disguised, the truth softened into something presentable. I tell myself to breathe, to listen, to stay present, because presence is a performance here, and I am good at performance. Someone clinks their glass, the sound rings clear and the echo settles into my chest like a held note, steady and precise. I think about how reflections lie by telling partial truths, how a glass can show you everything and nothing at once, and I keep my hands folded, nails pressed lightly into my palm, a private anchor. He smiles, waits for the applause that will follow his toast, and I see how the room leans toward him, how the story he tells fits neatly into the picture we've all agreed to display. In the brightest rooms, cruelty survives by borrowing the language of praise. Applause arrives on cue, polite and measured, and I join in, because not joining would be conspicuous, because the rhythm of clapping keeps my body from betraying me. The glassware vibrates, reflections trembling, and for a split second my face fractures into too many pieces to manage. But then it settles again, the image smoothing itself out. He lowers his glass, satisfied, and murmurs something to the person beside him, a private aside that doesn't reach me, though the sound reaches my skin like static. I move toward the kitchen under the pretense of checking on the next course, grateful for motion, for the chance to let my smile rest where fewer eyes can see it. And as I pass the mirrored sideboard, my reflection follows, obedient, impeccable. The heat under the makeup flares and fades, a reminder and a warning, and I steady myself with the cool edge of the counter, feeling the room continue without me, the laughter resuming the story intact. The reflection shows a woman composed enough to host, to serve, to endure the evening with grace, and I accept her help, because tonight is not about interruption, it's about timing. I glance back once, catch the table in the mirror, the glasses lifted, the light unwavering, and I understand how easily a room can be taught what to see. I let the glass show them what they expect, saving the angle that matters for later. The kitchen door swings softly, the noise dims, and I exhale into the quiet, counting the seconds, until I return already planning the steps that keep everything smooth. The reflection disappears as the door closes, leaving me alone with the echo of applause and the knowledge that this dinner has only just begun. The house had always sounded calm in the early evenings, a controlled hush that made every movement feel deliberate, and I used to think that quiet meant safety. I remembered the way I would arrive home before him, set my bag down, and turn the lock with a practiced wrist, the metal cool against my skin, as the door closed behind me with a sound so soft it barely registered. The cold doorknob was always the first thing I touched, grounding familiar a boundary I believed I controlled, and I would pause there listening, making sure the rooms were still empty, that the air hadn't shifted. I moved through the house with efficiency, setting out ingredients, aligning plates, letting routine soothe me because routine had a way of disguising tension as order. He liked things prepared, like to arrive to a scene that made sense, and I learned early how to give him that without being asked. Conversation flowed easily then, or at least it appeared to his questions framed as interest, his comments wrapped in humor, and I answered carefully, always watching how his mood settled into the space like a temperature change. I told myself this was partnership, that adjustment was a skill, and the house rewarded me with silence when I did it well. Sometimes, as I passed the hallway mirror, I caught my face twice, once straight on, and once in the slanted edge of glass, never quite matching, and I dismissed it as bad lighting. I was good at dismissing things that didn't fit, good at letting reflections lie if they kept the picture smooth. The kitchen smelled of citrus and herbs, a clean brightness that suggested freshness, and I focused on textures, on the weight of a pan, on the precise cut of a knife, anything that kept my hands busy and my thoughts narrow. He would come in talking about his day, voice filling the room, and I would nod, smile, adjust my stance so he could pass without brushing too close a choreography refined over time. If his tone shifted, I noticed. If it didn't, I relaxed, measuring my success by the absence of disruption. I learned which jokes landed and which didn't, which silences meant comfort and which meant evaluation, and I adjusted accordingly, believing that awareness equaled control. The cold doorknob became a ritual touchstone, something solid and honest, in a house where everything else felt conditional, and I convinced myself that rituals were proof of stability. When friends asked how we were, I answered with specifics about meals and schedules, the visible markers of normal life, and they nodded satisfied. The reflection in the mirror lingered longer some days, catching my expression at an angle that felt unfamiliar, and I would smooth my hair, straighten my shoulders, telling myself that everyone looked strange from the side. He never raised his voice then, not in ways that mattered, and when his hand closed around my wrist to steer me past a guest or guide me through a crowded room, I called it attentiveness, ignoring the way my skin remembered pressure. The house rewarded denial with ease. Nothing broke, nothing spilled, and the quiet stayed intact. Normalcy is easiest to protect when you measure it by what doesn't happen. I became fluent in anticipation, in spotting the moment just before a mood turned, in redirecting conversations, in lowering my own needs so the balance held. The doorknob cooled my palm each night, a reset, a promise that tomorrow would begin cleanly if I followed the rules I'd written for myself. The mirror offered brief, distorted versions of me that I learned not to study too closely, because studying invited questions, and questions threatened the calm. He smiled more often when I anticipated correctly, and I stored those smiles as evidence that my methods worked, that effort could replace honesty without consequence. The house remained orderly, admired, and I took pride in how seamlessly it ran, how little attention it demanded from anyone else. It wasn't until later that I understood how silence can train you, how it teaches you to confuse stillness with safety and reflection with truth. I closed the door gently each night, fingers brushing the cold metal, believing I was keeping something out, unaware of what had already been let in. The first thing that felt wrong was how ordinary it looked. I found the torn envelope wedged between a stack of menus and a folded receipt, its edge ripped unevenly as if someone had opened it in a hurry and then thought better of keeping it. I remembered standing in the kitchen with it in my hand, the paper light but insistent, noticing how the tear exposed a corner of printed text that didn't belong to any bill I recognized. The house was quiet, then the kind of quiet that invites scrutiny, and I stood by the counter turning the envelope just enough to catch the light, watching the fibers of paper fray where the seal had been forced. Inside was nothing but a folded printout, creased once then again, as if it had been handled too often to remain accidental. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, told myself that clutter happens, that paperwork migrates, but my fingers lingered on the edge where the tear refused to look clean. I unfolded the paper slowly, careful not to damage it further, and there it was, a phone screenshot cropped tight showing a message header and a timestamp that made my stomach tighten before my mind caught up. The time read 10:42. The date line abbreviated the sender's name partially cut off, but the format was unmistakable, and beneath it sat a brief line of text that contradicted a story I'd been told more than once. I checked the corner for confirmation, the small indicator that marked the capture a faint IMG string and a truncated reference code that ended in 47, enough detail to anchor it in reality. He had said he was home that night, said we'd eaten together, said he remembered the conversation, and the memory had seemed solid because I'd needed it to be. I stood there replaying that evening, the order of events, the way I'd plated the food, the show we'd watched, and felt the sequence wobble as the timestamp pressed against it. The envelope shook slightly in my hand, not from fear exactly, but from the effort of holding two versions of the same night at once. I folded the paper back the way I'd found it, smoothing the crease as if tidiness could restore logic, and slid it onto the counter, where the light caught it again, reflecting off the glossy surface, just enough to show my face twice in the stainless steel backsplash. The reflection didn't line up. One version of me looked composed, the other alert, and I told myself that lighting can do that reflections lie without intention. When he came home later, I watched him from the corner of my eye as he set his keys down the familiar rhythm, intact, his voice easy as he asked about dinner, and I answered with the right amount of detail testing whether the lie in my head would surface in his tone. It didn't. He moved through the room with the same confidence, the same casual authority, and for a moment I wondered if I'd misread the screenshot, if the date could mean something else, if the image had been taken out of context. I didn't ask him about it, didn't mention the envelope, because the room felt fragile in a way I couldn't articulate, and I had learned what questions do to fragile things. Later alone again, I took the paper back out, held it closer this time, noting the alignment of text, the way the minute marker sat, just before the colon precise and unforgiving. I compared it to my own phone, scrolled back through my photos, matched the font, the spacing, the format, and felt the last thread of dismissal fray. The torn envelope became heavier with meaning, its damage no longer incidental, but purposeful, as if the act of tearing had been an attempt to interrupt a story before it could finish forming. I placed it in a drawer I rarely used, one reserved for odds and ends, telling myself I would decide later what to do with it, telling myself that certainty could wait. Truth doesn't arrive loudly. It slips in disguised as something you almost throw away. The days that followed carried on as usual, meals prepared, conversations navigated the routine intact, but I felt the weight of that screenshot pressing against each exchange, a silent counterpoint to his assurances. I noticed how he spoke about time, how often he referenced evenings and schedules with a looseness that suddenly felt strategic, and I cataloged those moments without reacting. The envelope stayed hidden, its torn edge, a private reminder that something had already been damaged, whether I acknowledged it or not. At night, when the house settled, I replayed the timestamp again, the exactness of it, and wondered how many other details I'd accepted because they fit the version of him I needed. I didn't confront him, didn't change my behavior, because suspicion is loud only if you let it be, and I wasn't ready to give it a voice. I learned instead to listen more carefully, to watch how reflections shift when you change your angle to hold on to fragments without explaining them. The envelope waited in the drawer, patient and incomplete, and I understood that once a fracture appears, even the smallest one, everything that follows must be handled differently. The paper rustled softly when I closed the drawer, a sound barely audible, but it stayed with me, a reminder that time once questioned never fully settles back into place. I carried the torn edge forward, letting it guide my silence into something sharper. The dinner unfolded the way public rituals always do, with a choreography that pretends neutrality while quietly assigning roles, and I moved through it as if I'd been rehearsing my whole life. The table was set longer than usual, polished wood reflecting faces and candlelight, and the glass ashtray sat near the center, like an artifact from another era, clean but conspicuous, catching stray reflections as guests took their seats. I watched people arrive, coats handed off, compliments exchanged, the room filling with the low murmur of familiarity, and I felt the shift as the house became a stage, every gesture suddenly amplified by witness. He greeted everyone with warmth, handshakes, firm laughter, easy, his arm resting lightly at my back, in a way that read as affectionate from a distance and directive up close, and I adjusted my posture to match the image we were selling. The ashtray reflected the chandelier in sharp fragments, light breaking into angles that made it hard to tell where one face ended and another began, and I found myself watching those angles instead of the people, because angles don't pretend. Conversation flowed, stories, traded wine poured, and I answered questions about menus and sourcing with practiced ease, letting competence stand in for intimacy. At one point, as plates were cleared and new ones arrived, I caught a snippet of conversation just beyond my immediate circle. His voice lowered, casual, directed at someone who leaned in with interest, and I slowed my steps without stopping, my attention narrowing. He laughed softly and said something about my being clumsy lately, the word delivered like a joke, harmless on the surface, and the person beside him chuckled in response, eyes flicking briefly toward me before sliding away. The sound landed harder than I expected, not because it was loud, but because it was precise, a public framing that turned something private into a shared understanding. I watched the reaction ripple, subtle but real. A few smiles tightening a pause before conversation resumed, and I noted how easily the room absorbed the narrative he offered. The ashtray caught my face again as I leaned in to adjust a place setting, the reflection splitting my expression into composure and alertness, and I felt the urge to correct the story rise and settle without finding words. Another guest commented on how attentive he was, how lucky I must feel, and I nodded, letting the compliment pass through me without landing, aware that disagreement would require explanation, and explanation would invite scrutiny. The room's light grew warmer as the evening progressed, shadows, lengthening reflections, deepening, and I became acutely aware of how many eyes there were, how many angles, how many versions of truth being quietly negotiated. At the far end of this table, someone repeated his joke, adding a playful exaggeration, and laughter followed a collective agreement that this was acceptable, amusing, harmless, and I felt the shift from private discomfort to public inscription. The ashtray vibrated slightly as someone set a glass down too hard, the sound sharp enough to draw glances, and in that brief stillness, I saw it, the sister-in-law's eyes narrowing, her attention fixing on my face with a concern she didn't voice, a recognition that didn't require confirmation. She said nothing, but the look lingered, a silent acknowledgement that something had crossed a line, and I stored it, carefully aware that witness doesn't always announce itself. The conversation moved on, the moment absorbed, but the damage remained subtle and effective, reshaping how the room understood me without my consent. Humiliation doesn't need volume. It only needs witnesses willing to laugh. As dessert was served, he raised his glass again, making a show of gratitude, and I stood when expected, accepting applause that felt like a verdict more than praise. The ashtray reflected our joined image, distorted just enough to blur the difference between affection and control, and I realized how easily public spaces can be taught what to see when the script is confident. When the evening wound down and coats were retrieved, people lingered to say their goodbyes, and more than one person offered me a look that hovered between sympathy and complicity, an unspoken suggestion that endurance was admirable. I thanked them all, voice steady, because refusing admiration would have required naming its cost. As the last guest left and the door closed, the room exhaled noise draining away, and I remained by the table for a moment, fingers resting on the edge, the ashtray cold beneath my touch. I replayed the overheard line in my head, the timing of it the way it had been received, and understood that this was no longer just about private doubt, but about a public version of me being authored without my input. Once a story is told out loud, silence becomes a kind of agreement. I gathered the remaining glasses, careful not to let them clink, and carried them toward the kitchen, the reflections trailing after me like evidence that didn't need labels. The house returned to quiet, but it was a different quiet now, one that carried the weight of laughter and looks, and the knowledge that someone else had noticed. I rinsed the ashtray and set it aside, watching the water distort its surface, and felt the resolve begin to take shape, not as anger, but as clarity. The public moment had passed, but it had left a mark, and I knew that what followed would have to account for witnesses, for angles, for the way truth behaves when it's seen. The room emptied, yet the laughter stayed lodged where my voice should have been. The quiet after the guests left felt heavier than the noise that preceded it, as if the house had absorbed every laugh and comment, and now held them in suspension, waiting to see what I would do next. I moved through the dining room, methodically clearing plates, stacking them with care because order was the easiest way to keep my hands from shaking. The receipt slip lay where I hadn't noticed it before, half tucked beneath a folded napkin near the counter, thin paper curling slightly at the edge, and I paused when I saw it, struck by how something so small could demand attention simply by refusing to belong. I picked it up between my fingers, feeling the faint grease stain that marked it as recent, ordinary, forgettable to anyone not looking closely, and scanned the printed line without fully meaning to. There was nothing dramatic there. Just a sequence of items, a timestamp, a register code that ended in a clipped number, enough detail to root it in a specific moment. I knew the moment it pointed to, knew where I had been when that purchase was made, knew that he had told me a different version of the evening it referenced. I set the receipt down, then picked it up again, aligning it with the counter's edge, as if straightening it might straighten the logic it disrupted, and felt the familiar tightening in my chest that came from holding contradiction too long. This wasn't proof in the way movies promise, not a revelation that demanded confrontation, but it fit too neatly alongside the torn envelope, alongside the overheard joke, alongside the way my body had learned to brace before my mind caught up. I began to notice patterns instead of incidents, how often I adjusted my sleeves, how often I chose longer hairstyles, how often my explanations for small injuries sounded rehearsed even to me. When friends asked casual questions, "How did you manage that bruise? Why were you limping last week?" I heard myself answer with practiced ease, the words sliding into place without friction, and I realized how fluent I'd become in smoothing over the edges of my own life. The receipt slip became a symbol of that fluency, a record not just of a transaction, but of timing of where he claimed to be versus where he was documented, of how often I had accepted the explanation that required less disruption. I folded it once, then again, feeling the paper soften along the crease, and slid it into the same drawer as the envelope, aware that I was building a quiet archive without fully admitting why. The kitchen light hummed softly, steady and indifferent, and I leaned against the counter, letting the cool surface ground me as I replayed recent weeks with new attention. I saw how silence had been used strategically, how a lack of response could function as correction, how praise followed compliance and withdrawal followed resistance. My own behavior began to look like evidence too, the way I tracked his moods, the way I anticipated shifts, the way I learned to disappear just enough to keep things calm. Patterns don't announce themselves. They ask how long you're willing to call them coincidence. I thought about the dinner again, about the laughter that had come too easily, about the look from his sister that had flickered and vanished, and I understood that what hurt most wasn't the joke itself, but the way it fit so comfortably into an existing structure. I washed the remaining glasses, watching the water bead and slide distorting reflections until faces became unrecognizable, and felt a strange clarity settle in, not relief, but recognition. This was no longer about a single lie or a single moment of cruelty. It was about a system that rewarded my silence and punished my resistance in increments small enough to be denied. I dried my hands and returned to the drawer, opening it just long enough to confirm the presence of the receipt and the envelope, then closing it again because naming them would have required action, and I wasn't ready for action yet. Instead, I began to observe myself with the same care I applied to everything else, noting how my shoulders tightened when he entered a room, how my voice softened instinctively, how my body remembered impact even when my face did not. The realization didn't come with drama, only with a steady accumulation of details that refused to cancel each other out. Silence stopped feeling protective the moment I saw how carefully it had been trained. I cleaned the kitchen until it shone, restoring the appearance of order, because appearances still mattered. But the work felt different now, purposeful, in a way I couldn't fully articulate. When he came in later and asked if I was tired, I said yes and meant something else entirely, watching how he accepted the answer without curiosity. That night, as the house settled and the familiar quiet returned, I lay awake cataloging behaviors the way I once cataloged menus, precise and unsentimental understanding that this inventory would change what came next. The receipt slip waited in the drawer, unremarkable and insistent, and I understood that the break had already happened, not outwardly, but internally, where denial had finally exhausted its usefulness. I let the drawer close on the evidence, knowing it would open the moment I stopped pretending coincidence was enough. The hallway light had started to flicker a few days after the dinner, a small electrical hiccup I might have ignored before, but now it caught my attention every time I passed beneath it, the rhythm uneven enough to feel intentional. I noticed it late one evening when the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies irregularities, and I stood there longer than necessary, watching the light stutter and recover, casting alternating bands of brightness and shadow across the wall. The flickering bulb made the framed photos along the corridor jump between clarity and blur faces appearing and disappearing, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, as if the house itself was rehearsing the truth in fragments. I told myself it was nothing that old fixtures do this, but I didn't move on right away. Instead, I stayed counting the intervals, noticing how the pauses didn't follow a clean pattern, how the light lingered too long before stabilizing again. When I finally reached the study, I pulled open the drawer where I'd begun storing things and took out the torn envelope and the folded receipt, laying them side by side on the desk beneath the flicker. The alternating light made the printed text waiver numbers brightening, then dimming, and I felt an odd sense of alignment, as if the environment were conspiring to force my attention where it belonged. I unfolded the screenshot again, smoothing it carefully, and this time I compared it directly against the receipt, aligning the times, the sequence of events, the story he'd repeated without hesitation. The screenshot showed a message activity time that fell squarely within a window he'd insisted we spent together, the minute marker exact, the formatting consistent. And when I checked the receipt's register time, a different discrepancy emerged, a gap that shouldn't have existed if his version were accurate. I opened my laptop and pulled up a calendar view, reconstructing the evening with care, slotting in commitments, meals, conversations, noting where his presence had been claimed versus where records suggested otherwise. The flickering light above me made the desk lamps glow pulse shadows crawling across the paper, and in that unsteady illumination, the contradictions became harder to dismiss. I noticed a small detail I'd missed before, a truncated reference number on the screenshot that matched a pattern I'd seen on other images, confirming its authenticity, and a transaction code on the receipt that placed it firmly at a location he'd never mentioned. The realization didn't arrive with shock, but with a sinking certainty, like recognizing a melody you've heard before but never named. I remembered how confidently he spoke about that night, how he filled in details when I hesitated, and how easily I'd accepted his certainty as proof. The flicker intensified briefly, the light splitting my reflection in the darkened screen of the laptop, and I caught my face divided, one half lit, the other obscured, mirroring the way the truth had been parceled out to me in pieces. The flicker splits my reflection as the time stamp slips. I felt a surge of panic, then not loud, but sharp, a spike that cut through the controlled calm I'd maintained, because this wasn't just about mistrust anymore. It was about time itself being manipulated about reality, edited with confidence. I closed my eyes and breathed, grounding myself in the chair, reminding myself that panic would only blur what needed focus. When I opened them again, I took photographs of the documents laid out together, capturing the times, the codes, the alignment careful to include enough detail to anchor them later. I saved the images with neutral file names, an act that felt both meticulous and dangerous, and backed them up to a drive I kept separate from my usual devices. The flickering bulb steadied for a moment, bathing the room in consistent light, and I felt a strange gratitude for the pause, as if the house were offering me a brief truce. I replayed conversations in my head, noting how often he'd referenced time loosely, how phrases like around then and after that had smoothed over specifics, and I saw now how that looseness created space for contradiction without immediate detection. When time fractures lies, stop needing imagination. The thought settled heavily, clarifying rather than overwhelming, and I understood why this moment mattered more than the earlier ones. It wasn't just evidence of something happening elsewhere. It was evidence of a narrative engineered to control my perception. I gathered the papers and returned them to the drawer this time, arranging them deliberately, layering them in an order that made sense to me, an internal logic that no longer relied on his explanations. As I closed the drawer, the light flickered again, shorter this time, a brief interruption that felt almost like punctuation. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the house, aware of how my own breathing had changed, slower now, more measured, and I recognized the shift inside me from passive observation to active assessment. This wasn't resolve yet, not action, but it was clarity, the kind that reorganizes priorities without announcing itself. I knew that what I'd found would need corroboration, that I couldn't rely on my interpretation alone, and the thought of bringing someone else into the picture sent another jolt of fear through me, tempered by necessity. I turned off the desk lamp and stood, letting the hallway light guide me back toward the bedroom, the flicker less pronounced now, as if it had served its purpose. As I passed the mirror at the end of the hall, my reflection steadied whole for a moment, and I held that image, understanding that fragmentation was no longer something I could afford. The house settled into a deeper quiet, but beneath it ran a current of inevitability, a sense that the pattern I'd traced had reached a point where it would demand acknowledgement beyond these walls. I lay down without turning on another light, eyes open in the dark, replaying the alignment of numbers and times, feeling the weight of what they implied. The seconds kept perfect time, indifferent to the story he told. The first time I brought someone else into the orbit of what I knew, I did it indirectly, the way you test ice before stepping onto it, careful not to announce intention. The venue manager had emailed earlier about a routine follow-up from the dinner, a polite note thanking us for hosting and mentioning a minor scheduling discrepancy with their staff, and I seized on that thread because it came with neutrality built in. I met him in the quiet lobby of the space a few days later, the place stripped of candles and guests, daylight flattening everything into honesty, and I listened as he explained how their systems logged events automatically, how timing mattered more to them than memory. The audio recorder sat in my bag, small and unremarkable, and I told myself it was there for clarity, for my own recall, nothing more, as I set it on the table between us without comment. He spoke calmly about the cameras positioned near the service entrance, about angles chosen for coverage rather than intimacy, and when he mentioned reviewing footage to resolve the discrepancy, I felt the room tilt slightly, possibility widening. I asked questions that sounded logistical about timestamps and storage, about how long records were retained, and he answered without suspicion, tapping a key ring against the table as he spoke, the sound steady and precise. When he pulled up a still frame on his tablet, a grainy image frozen mid-motion, my attention narrowed to the corner where a time code glowed faintly, anchoring the scene to a specific minute. The figure entering the frame wasn't clear enough to identify without context, but the posture was familiar, the confidence unmistakable, and I felt a cold clarity settle as the date aligned with the night in question. The recorder caught the soft click of his pen, the rustle of his jacket, as he leaned closer, and his matter-of-fact tone as he explained how often people misremember evenings when documentation disagrees. I nodded, thanked him, kept my face neutral, because this wasn't the moment for reaction. It was the moment for collection. Outside, the afternoon noise resumed traffic, and voices blending into something ordinary, and I sat in my car for a moment before driving away, listening back to the brief exchange, noting how calm everything sounded, how devastating neutrality can be when it confirms what you already fear. Authority doesn't accuse, it simply records what happened and lets silence do the rest. I didn't tell my husband about the meeting, didn't mention the follow-up, because the power of this information lay in its quiet, in the way it existed independently of our arguments or my credibility. Instead, I observed him more closely in the days that followed, watching how he referenced that evening again, how his confidence remained intact, how easily he performed certainty when he believed no one was checking. The recorder stayed hidden, its presence a reminder that truth doesn't always need a witness willing to speak, only a system willing to remember. When I finally filed the audio away alongside the other materials, I felt the shape of the situation change, the boundaries expanding beyond our home into places he couldn't manage with charm alone. Once the record exists, denial becomes a performance with an ending. I sat with that thought, aware that bringing authority into the picture carried risk as well as protection, that escalation invites response, and that response can be unpredictable. But I also knew something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer just my interpretation against his assurance, it was an external trace, a quiet confirmation that didn't need me to argue for it. I turned off the recorder, the click final and clean, and placed it carefully in the drawer, understanding that the next steps would require timing as much as courage. The room felt larger now, and the silence carried weight instead of fear. The silver key had been sitting on the ring longer than I could remember, a spare I'd never needed to use, its surface dulled by time and neglect, and I found myself turning it over in my palm while I waited for the bank app to load. The motion steadied me, metal cool against skin, the familiar weight a reminder that access often exists long before permission is granted. I'd told myself I was only checking something small, a routine glance at statements the way anyone might. But as the numbers populated, the screen routine gave way to pattern. Transactions appeared in neat rows, dates abbreviated amounts, rounded descriptions generic enough to pass without scrutiny, and I scrolled slowly, aligning them mentally with evenings I remembered too clearly. One entry caught, then another, both falling within windows he'd described differently, each tied to a location he'd never mentioned, the merchant code clipped and impersonal, but unmistakably out of place. I tapped into the details, letting the app expand the line, revealing a reference number and a timestamp that slotted neatly into the gap the camera footage had outlined, and felt the shift happen all at once, the moment when doubt collapses under accumulation. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a structure reinforced across systems that didn't talk to each other, but agreed all the same. I set the phone down and picked it up again, checking my own memory against the data, replaying those nights with precision. Now the dinners plated, the messages exchanged, the excuses offered, and the silver key rotated between my fingers, as if urging me to unlock what I'd been avoiding. I cross-referenced the entries with a calendar view counting backward, matching the times to his claims, and watched the story he'd curated lose coherence in real time. The room felt suddenly too quiet, the hum of appliances distant, and I noticed how my body reacted before my thoughts did, shoulders dropping, breath deepening, a release that surprised me with its intensity. I realized then how much energy I'd spent sustaining uncertainty, how heavy ambiguity had been, and how light clarity felt by comparison, even when it carried consequences. The key glinted as I set it beside the phone, its reflective surface catching my face at an angle that felt unguarded, and I allowed myself to look without correcting the image. When numbers agree with silence, the story stops being yours to doubt. I opened the drawer and spread the materials out again. The screenshot, The receipt, the audio file cued on my recorder, and now the transaction details printed and annotated, each piece distinct but converging. And I understood why this moment mattered more than the others. It wasn't additive, it was transformative. The financial trail did what the personal never could, stripped intention from explanation and replaced it with sequence, location, and time, indifferent to charm or denial. I took screenshots capturing the reference codes and minute markers, careful to frame them cleanly, and saved them with the same neutral naming convention, building a record that didn't rely on my voice to be believed. As I worked, I noticed a steadiness settle in, not courage exactly, but acceptance. The understanding that the shape of the truth had outgrown my capacity to keep it contained. I thought about the dinner again, about the laughter that had folded cruelty into humor, about the way witnesses had been recruited without their consent, and I saw now how the financial record extended that pattern outward, implicating systems that don't bend for performance. Money leaves footprints even when people insist they were never there. The realization landed with force, a clean break from the hesitation that had governed me, and I felt the internal pivot complete the shift from gathering to deciding. I wasn't angry in the way I'd imagined I might be. Instead, I felt resolved, as if a line had been drawn by something more reliable than emotion. I placed the silver key back on its ring, no longer a spare, but a symbol of access I was prepared to use, and closed the drawer with intention, the click decisive. I knew the next steps would be public, in ways the earlier ones hadn't been, that exposure would require timing and witnesses, and that the dinner table, where everything had been staged, would soon host a different kind of truth. The house seemed to register the change, sounds sharper, light clearer, and I moved through the rooms with a purpose that didn't ask permission. I rehearsed, nothing planned, no speeches, because the evidence had learned to speak for itself, and all that remained was choosing when to let it. I sat down, phone dark in my hand, and allowed the weight of the decision to settle without rushing it, aware that restraint had carried me this far, and that action would need to be just as precise. The silver key rested against my palm one last time before I set it down, its coolness a promise rather than a warning. I closed the drawer, knowing the lock I needed to turn was no longer the door. Time began to feel different once the decision settled, compressed and sharpened, as if every minute now carried a consequence. I noticed it first in the way I watched the wristwatch on my own arm, the second hand sweeping with an indifference that felt almost insulting, marking moments he still believed belonged to him. The watch caught the light when I tilted my wrist, the glass face reflecting the room in miniature, and I thought about how often he'd checked his own watch during conversations, a habit I'd once read as efficiency and now recognized as control. I waited for the house to empty before I moved, choosing a late afternoon when he was out, when the silence felt neutral instead of charged, and I took the audio recorder from the drawer with deliberate care. I'd listened to the file before, but this time I didn't stop at the beginning. I scrubbed through it, searching for the segment that mattered most, the part I'd initially avoided because it sounded too close to confrontation. The fragment was brief, barely a minute, but it contained the thing denial hates most. His voice adjusting mid-sentence, confidence slipping just enough to reveal calculation, an admission wrapped in correction. The timestamp on the file aligned with the footage, with the transactions, with the gaps he'd smoothed over so carefully, and as I listened, I felt the last internal argument dissolve. There was no alternative explanation left that didn't require contortions I was no longer willing to perform. I replayed the clip, isolating the moment where his tone changed, where the truth surfaced and was immediately managed, and I noted the time code, the reference marker, the way the recorder captured the shift without commentary. I saved a duplicate labeled neutrally and stored it alongside the others, understanding that redundancy wasn't paranoia now, but prudence. The watch ticked on steady, and I realized how close I was to the point of no return, how every action from here forward would narrow options rather than preserve them. Fear flared briefly, sharp and familiar, but it didn't take hold the way it once had, because fear thrives on uncertainty, and uncertainty was no longer the dominant condition. I thought about the people who had laughed at dinner, about the ones who had looked away, and about the sister-in-law whose glance had lingered just long enough to register, and I understood that silence would soon shift its allegiance. Once a decision is made, hesitation starts to look like collaboration. I checked the watch again, noting the exact minute, and sent a short message to the venue manager confirming the time of a follow-up meeting, the wording polite, logistical, unremarkable. I drafted another message I didn't send yet, one that would invite a small group back to the table under the pretense of closure, a final dinner to clear the air, and I saved it without scheduling, aware that timing would matter as much as content. The weight of the choice pressed in, not crushing, but firm, like a hand at my back, urging me forward, and I let myself acknowledge the cost, without trying to soften it. This would be public. It would be irrevocable. It would change how people spoke about us and how they saw me, but it would also end the quiet negotiation that had governed my life for too long. I placed the recorder back in the drawer, aligning it neatly, and fastened my watch with a precise click, the sound final enough to feel ceremonial. I rehearsed nothing, because rehearsals are for performances, and what I was preparing was disclosure. Time stops belonging to liars the moment their words can be replayed. I stood there for a moment, hand resting on the desk, feeling the room settle around the decision, and then I moved, packing the materials into a folder I could reach quickly, the order intentional. The house felt smaller now, less like a refuge, and more like a corridor leading somewhere unavoidable, and I walked through it without pausing, letting the watch mark each step. When I reached the door, I glanced once more at the time, committing it to memory, and stepped outside, the air cooler clearer, as if the world beyond the walls had been waiting for me to catch up. The second hand crossed the dial, and with it every excuse ran out. The room felt different the moment the guests arrived, less theatrical than the first dinner, more alert, as if everyone sensed an agenda, even if they couldn't name it. I'd chosen the same space deliberately, the same long table, the same chandelier, because repetition sharpens contrast, and I wanted memory working for me instead of against me. Plates were set simply this time, fewer distractions. The lighting adjusted just enough to keep faces visible without flattering them, and when I placed the mirror shard near my place setting, it looked accidental, a fragment left over from a broken frame, catching light in a way that drew the eye without explanation. Conversation started cautiously polite, but thin, and I let it run its course, listening more than speaking, watching how he settled into his chair with familiar confidence, how his posture suggested ownership even now. The shard reflected the ceiling in jagged lines, splitting the glow into sharp angles, and I noticed how often people glanced at it and then away uneasy, without knowing why. When the time felt right, not dramatic, just inevitable, I stood and thanked everyone for coming back, my voice steady, unadorned, and said I wanted to clarify something that had lingered since the last gathering. He smiled, at first indulgent, ready to steer the moment, and I let him, because contrast requires space. I set my phone on the table screen dark and placed the recorder beside it, their presence quiet but unmistakable, then slid the folder forward, stopping it with the mirror shard so it didn't tip. The sound of paper settling cut through the room more cleanly than any speech could have. I began with logistics, not accusations describing how a venue discrepancy had led to a review, how timestamps matter when systems don't negotiate with memory, and I watched faces shift from politeness to focus as I played a short clip, the audio brief and clear, his voice adjusting mid-sentence, the admission there if you listened without trying to rescue it. The room stilled, forks paused, breath held, and I let the silence do its work before turning the screen toward them, where a still frame from the camera froze the service entrance with a glowing time code in the corner. The date aligned with the night in question. I followed it with the transaction record, the reference number and minute marker displayed without commentary, then the screenshot aligned side by side so the pattern read itself. He leaned forward, a practiced move, and began to speak, but I raised my hand slightly, not to silence him, just to pace the sequence, and continued explaining how independent records converge when the story is accurate and diverge when it isn't. The mirror shard caught his face as he shifted, breaking it into angles that made charm look like calculation, and I felt the room recalibrate the way attention redistributes when certainty evaporates. Someone asked a clarifying question, cautious and precise, and the venue manager, present by prior agreement, answered with neutral authority, confirming retention angles and times without naming intent. When truth is assembled from systems that don't collude, denial loses its rhythm. He tried again, softer this time, framing, minimizing, suggesting context, and I let him finish because interruption would have looked defensive, and I wasn't defending anything anymore. I returned to the shard, turned it slightly so it reflected the table, the witnesses, the evidence, and said simply that this was why the joke had landed the way it did, why silence had felt compulsory, why patterns matter more than apologies. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. The shard reflected his hands as they tightened, then loosened, the micro-adjustments of someone recalculating in public, and I felt the shift complete as people began to look at him differently, not with outrage, but with comprehension. The sister-in-law spoke then briefly, naming what she'd seen without embellishment, and the admission carried weight because it didn't seek drama. He stood abruptly, chair-scraping, and the sound felt out of proportion a tell, and when he tried to leave the venue, manager asked him to wait, procedural, calm, explaining next steps without threat. A mirror doesn't argue. It only refuses to smooth what's jagged. I gathered the papers and slid them back into the folder, careful, methodical, because closure isn't chaos. It's order restored on different terms. The room exhaled conversation, restarting in low tones, not celebratory, not cruel, just recalibrated, and I realized how quickly a public narrative can change when it's anchored to verifiable time. I didn't look at him as he spoke with the manager. I watched the shard instead, how it caught the chandelier and fractured it into honest light. When I finally stood to leave, there was no applause, this time, no ritual to soften the moment, only nods and a few quiet words of support that didn't ask me to perform resilience. I pocketed the shard, feeling its cool edge, and walked out under the same lights that had once made everything look acceptable. The door closed behind me, and the room kept the truth without my supervision. The aftermath didn't arrive with sirens or raised voices, but with paperwork schedules and the quiet authority of process, the kind that reshapes lives without spectacle. I learned quickly how public truths move once released, how they travel through rooms and offices with a steadiness that feels almost merciful after chaos. The venue followed protocol statements taken, footage, archived timelines confirmed, and I watched from the periphery as the situation detached itself from our marriage and entered a realm where tone and charm had limited reach. The empty frame appeared the next morning when I walked through the living room and noticed the space above the console where a photograph had hung for years, its outline faint on the wall, like a memory that hadn't fully let go. He'd taken the picture down. In the night, I realized an instinctive attempt to curate absence, and the blank rectangle felt more honest than the image ever had. I didn't replace it. I left the wall bare and felt something settle, a permission to let the story exist without decoration. Messages came in from people who had been at the table, careful and measured, offering support without demanding details, and I answered selectively because I was no longer obligated to manage their comfort. He tried to speak to me once in the kitchen, voice low and controlled, explaining context, expressing regret in a tone that suggested negotiation. And I listened without interrupting, noticing how the words searched for leverage that wasn't there anymore. I told him we would communicate through counsel and process, not because I wanted distance for its own sake, but because clarity thrives in structure. The statement landed without argument, and he nodded as if understanding, though his eyes tracked the empty frame instead of me. I spent the afternoon organizing what needed to be done. Appointments set, documents filed, routines adjusted, and the work felt grounding, not numbing, because it was oriented toward resolution rather than concealment. The sister-in-law checked in briefly, her message simple, acknowledging what she'd seen and said, and I thanked her without ceremony, recognizing how small acts of witnessing can tip the balance of a room. I took a walk as dusk approached, the air cool and even, and noticed how my shoulders no longer anticipated collision at every sound. The neighborhood looked the same, ordinary and unremarkable, and I felt a quiet astonishment at how normal the world remains when your private earthquake becomes public record. Back home, the empty frame drew my eye again, its edges clean, its absence definitive, and I thought about how many years I'd spent adjusting images to keep them hanging straight. Justice doesn't shout. It rearranges the furniture until the room finally makes sense. There were consequences I hadn't anticipated, small and logistical, like calendar conflicts and shared accounts that required disentangling, and larger ones that settled into conversations and glances, but none of them asked me to pretend anymore. When someone suggested mediation framed as reconciliation, I declined politely, explaining that the work ahead was about repair, not reunion, and the distinction felt precise rather than defensive. I slept that night without rehearsing explanations the first time in longer than I could remember, and woke to a stillness that didn't feel conditional. The next morning, I removed the remaining framed photos myself, stacking them carefully and setting them aside, not out of spite, but out of sequence. They belonged to a story that had reached its end. I cleaned the wall where the empty frame had been smoothing the paint and considered leaving it bare permanently, a reminder that absence can be chosen. When the picture comes down, what's left is the shape of truth, not the pose. Friends offered to come by to fill the space with presence, and I accepted some invitations and declined others, trusting my own sense of capacity for the first time. The process moved forward with its own tempo, hearings, scheduled boundaries clarified, and I felt my role shift from subject to participant, from someone managed by narrative to someone directing outcome. There were moments of grief, unannounced and sharp, but they didn't dislodge the clarity that had settled in. They passed through like weather acknowledged and allowed. I stood again in the living room as evening fell, the wall bare, the room quieter without the pressure of performance, and I understood that payoff isn't triumph, it's alignment, the relief of not carrying what was never yours to hold. I turned off the lights and let the space rest, knowing that what had been exposed could not be reassembled into its former arrangement. The house kept its order, and so did I, without the frame that once told us who to be. The dim lamp in the living room casts a narrow pool of light, steady and honest, and I sit within it without adjusting my posture or my face. The present has a different texture now, less elastic, more exact, and I notice how sounds arrive without warning, but also without threat. The soft click of the lamp switch, the distant passing of a car, the quiet settling of the house into evening. I move through the room slowly, aware of my body in a way that no longer feels like surveillance, and pause near the bare wall where the frames once hung, the absence still visible but no longer loud. The lamp reflects faintly off the polished floor, a single line of light stretching outward, and I think about how reflection once demanded strategy, how angles had to be managed to keep the image intact. Now the light simply exists, unnegotiated. I make tea and bring the mug back with me, the warmth grounding, and sit again, letting the moment arrive without rehearsal. There are still tasks ahead, timelines and conversations that will continue to shape the weeks to come, but they no longer define my attention the way they once did. They sit in their place, contained by process. I glance at my phone, unread messages waiting, and leave it face down, not out of avoidance, but because urgency has changed its meaning. The lamp hums softly, constant, and I feel a small satisfaction in the reliability of it, how it does what it's meant to do, without commentary. My reflection appears faintly in the darkened window beyond the light's reach, not fragmented, this time not doubled, just present, and I don't correct it. I remember the first dinner, the raised glass, the applause that asked me to disappear politely, and I feel no surge of anger now, only distance, the kind that allows memory without collapse. The room feels proportioned to me again, furniture arranged by choice rather than necessity, and I understand that control doesn't always announce itself as force. Sometimes it's the quiet permission to exist without explanation. The glass no longer bends, it finally tells the truth. I take a sip of tea and let the sentence settle, not as a declaration, but as a description of fact. The house holds its shape around me, walls no longer enlisted in performance, and I think about how many times I'd mistaken endurance for virtue, silence for strength. Strength I see now has texture. It resists distortion. I stand and turn off the lamp, letting the room return to darkness, gradually trusting that I know where everything is without needing to see it exaggerated. The future doesn't present itself as a spectacle, just as a sequence of ordinary days, and that ordinariness feels like a gift earned through precision rather than patience. I move toward the hallway mirror and stop catching my reflection one last time before passing whole and uncorrected, and I nod to it without ceremony. The night air slips in through a cracked window, cool and neutral, and I breathe it in steady and unafraid. What survives the light doesn't need to hide from it anymore. I close the window, set the mug in the sink, and return to the center of the room, standing where the lamp had been, aware of the space my body occupies and the ease of claiming it. There is no audience now, no script to honor only the present, doing its quiet work. I turn toward the bedroom without looking back, leaving the room exactly as it is, because nothing here needs rearranging to make sense anymore. The light goes out, and the truth stays put.